I'll just do a bit of an introduction. As part of the History Speaker Series, we are very pleased to have Cathy Walton here with us doing her presentation on Vanishing Barns. And you're seeing the cover of her book there as well, which is available by Cathy as well as through OMAH. So get your copy while you can. They're going hot, hot, hot. So it's a fascinating work that she's put together. So on your screen, we have, of course, Cathy. I am Lindsay Earle. I am the History Programming Coordinator at the Aurelia Museum. We have Ted Duncan, who is our board president. We're very happy that he was able to join us tonight. We have Trish Krogrand, who is the head of the History Committee at OMAH. And we have Dawn Phillip as well, who is our resident tech expert. So that is who you're seeing at the moment. We will be in and out, but of course, Cathy focusing on. Before I hand it off to Ted to introduce Cathy, I do want to say thank you very much to everyone who's attending tonight, as well as to two individuals without whom this night would not be possible. The first is Phil Jackman, who designs our posters for us, edits our text, and does a million other things when we ask him to. So thank you so much to Phil Jackman for his help. And the second is Marianne Grant, who is the muscle behind the History Speaker Series. She is the reason all of this is as effective and well put together as it is. So thank you so much to those two. It is now just a couple minutes after 7. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on. I'm going to hand it off to Ted Duncan now, who's going to introduce our speaker for this evening. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Cathy Walton. Retired from teaching and volunteered at the Simcoe County Museum. Barns are her passion. She remembers growing up on a farm on a concession road near Minising, west of Barrie, where there were 10 barns. She lives there now, but there are only 4 today. She remembers passing a barn that was falling down as she went to work each day and thought that she should stop and take a picture of it before it was gone. This led her to take pictures of more than 160 barns and tell their stories. It became a 6-year project, writing the barn tales into a book as told by the families who still live by them. Barns are the castles of Ontario and part of our heritage, but many are falling down. It is my passion to record photos of the pioneer structures in our area for future generations. Their stories are yet to be told, but tonight, Cathy Walton, author of Vanishing Barns, will tell you the stories of her gentle giants of Vespra. Welcome, Cathy Walton, to the Aurelia Museum of Art and History's History Speaker Night.
Thank you. I took this photograph on the road I live on long before I started the book, and the barn in the background is on the next concession. I decided to take pictures because nobody else was, and I didn't want there to be no record of barns. Springwater Township is located between Barrie and Wasaga Beach, and it was at Springwater Township that I focused on. Floss and Vespra townships were amalgamated in 1994. Although Vespra became a township in 1820 and Floss in 1822, the earliest dated barn I found was 1870. And there are probably older barns, but they're not dated, so it was hard to confirm. This picture was taken at Edenvale. A longtime resident kept scrapbooks. Her family digitized the photos, letters, and newspaper articles. I began by placing 300 self-addressed stamped envelopes in mailboxes around the township. 6 years later, with 365 pages completed, I decided the project was complete. As I interviewed people, I always asked for a story unique to their farm. After the interview, I would usually be given names of one or two other people. Oh, you need to go and see so-and-so to speak with. I ended up talking to hundreds. This story came from my neighbor down the road, and if I hadn't been writing the book, I would never have known about it. This is called a dump rake, and it would be pulled by a team of horses with a seat for the driver, and the seat's missing now. The team would go down the middle of cut hay, collecting it as it went through the teeth. The farmer would pull a lever, which would drop the hay in a pile. Carmen was on the rake when the team ran away. He fell off and was rolled into the teeth along with the hay. The load tripped and Carmen went out with the hay. He parked the dump rake, and to this day, probably 80 years later, it still sits in the same place. Of more than 400 barns in the area, I included just over 160 for the book, Vanishing Barns. And the main reason was the book would have been too huge to have even held. And although the barn and history are unique to this area, the stories could be stories from anywhere in Southern Ontario. Dating barns is often a guessing game. In most cases, the date is guessed at by who was farming at the time the barn was probably put up. This indicates the owner of the barn, but rarely the barn builder. In a few cases, the date is marked on the end of a barn, as it is here. These barns near Minising were built the same year by two different owners who lived next door to one another. So you can see the difference in how the date was put on. This particular barn had boards replaced by the present owner. Originally, it had read 1878 and OFW, and no one knew what OFW stood for. I talked to previous owners and they didn't know either. So this is one of my more exciting finds. In using, and this is a long name, the Union Publishing Companies of Ingersoll Farmers and Business Directory for the counties of Grey, Ontario and Simcoe, 1887, I discovered O.F. Wright was the original owner. This directory is available online for a number of different years, and it was very helpful in identifying many early owners. Dates and initials were sometimes carved into posts. This barn in Minising was built in August 1900. The boys carving their names would have been in their late teens. My grandfather's initials, GJ, are among them. And occasionally an owner would say they thought there was a date in a beam near the top of the barn. No one could be convinced to climb up to see, myself included. Early barns had a wooden 4x4-inch tracks for hay carriers. And you can see this is a diagram of a hay carrier. So at the bottom, there's a round hook, and that's where you'd put the sling to the sling, or the hay would be put into a sling and then brought up to the top of the barn. And depending on which way you pulled the rope, you could go into the left or the right-hand side of the mow. And you can see a steel track on this one. Tracks made from steel were introduced in the 1890s. So if your track is wooden, then you know that it's before 1890. And this barn was built by my husband's relatives, and it dates around 1890. In the Edenville area, barns can sometimes be dated by whether there are braces cut at the sawmill. The sawmill at Edenville came in after 1895, so this barn is after 1895. Journals were another source of information on when barns were built. John Kerfoot came to Minising in 1868 and mentioned the barn raising for this barn was June 8, 1876. And note the varying heights of the beams, which is unusual. Usually they're all the same across. And my grandfather, who owned this barn, referred to it as an English barn. Potatoes were stored in the barn after it was built. And then at a later date, my grandfather, when he had it, had the barn jacked up onto a cement foundation and moved out of a wet corner. And I discovered that they were always moving barns. It didn't seem to be a huge issue. Oh yeah, okay, we'll move that barn. And this barn is near Elmvale. 2 barns had previously burned down on this property. This third barn, built in 1968, is asymmetrical because it was built from 3 other barns brought from the Toronto area. Land was being cleared for new subdivisions and barns needed to be moved or torn down. 70-year-old Jack Pickering, who had built 18 barns in the area, and George Wicklum were in charge of the construction. Material from each barn had been numbered before being moved, and the combined material built the barn and a shed. That's me in the loft of the barn attempting to make sense of how it was rebuilt. Again, the asymmetrical outline of the barn is evident. I received a phone call from a nephew of Jack Pickering asking me if I wanted to see his tools. I jumped at the chance and was amazed at how little tools were used in building a barn. And Jack Pickering was especially proud of the 3 chisels he had acquired. He was really moving up when he had 3 chisels. And the larger tools were elsewhere. And when we do the tool quiz, you'll see those larger tools. My grandfather owned bush lots, and barn builders would sometimes acquire trees from him. And I had another fellow say it was as if the barn builders could look at the tree and just in their head know what the final result was going to be. There were very few plans made of barns. So this is where you come in. And this is, you're going to do this on your own. There are too many people to be getting people to give their input. So tool quiz. There's the first tool. And this is a broad axe. And it could be adapted for right or left-handed men. So if you were left-handed, you would just take the handle out and put it on the other side. And the handle curved away from the flat side to decrease injury when using. So men would stand on top of a tree and hack down the side and then roll it and square it up. And sometimes they would square up 4 sides and sometimes just 2 sides, depending on what needed to be done. The broad axe left distinctive markings on beams, as can be seen on the beam of this 1871 barn. And notice how old the rungs are on the ladder. Another fellow tell me that, in the beginning they had wonderful, huge pine trees or whatever they were making it from, but they weren't very good at building barns. It was something new to them. And so the one he was talking about wasn't quite square. And later on, builders were much better at building, but they didn't have the virgin trees to use as they had earlier. Your next tool. This is an adze. And it had a thin curved blade used for shaping wood, and it was sometimes used to make the beams. And this is a drill, and Drills were used to drill holes for the wooden pegs, and they worked well in hard to reach places. So you might be up, you might have the barn partly finished and need a place to put a peg. So someone would stand and use this and drill a hole to make room for a peg. This one you're looking straight down at it. And this was a boring machine, B-O-R-I-N-G. And it was also used to make holes, and it could be used where the wood was laid flat. It held an auger bit and made drilling holes easier and faster. The machine was turned with both hands while sitting on the base to keep it from moving. Cliff Wicklum, a nephew of the George Wicklum, the barn builder, helped with the boring machine during the summer when he was about 10. So the very young people were involved in the building. The machine would get stuck and it would have to be reversed 3 or 4 times until the shavings came out. And sometimes a pipe wrench was needed to reverse it. So this particular tool, where the slot is, there would be a pole go into it. And this is called a pike. And pikes were placed on top of poles of varying lengths. Charlie Parker and another man were raising the purlin plates using pike poles. And a purlin plate is the horizontal beam which supports the rafters and is supported by posts. And men were on the floor of the barn holding up the purlin plate with their pike poles. But the pike poles they were using were 2 or 3 feet too short to reach all the way to the top of the barn. Standing near the top of the barn with his hands under the beam, Charlie gave it everything he had and raised the purlin plate up himself. This resulted in 2 hernias, which he didn't have fixed until he was 75, and then wondered why he'd waited so long. So you can see the pike poles being used. And they were also used to raise the bents. So barns were put up in sections. So there would be different bents. So there might be, most of them would be 4 bents, and that's about a 40 foot length barn. Some were 5, the very occasional 6. And in 1953, the barn was dismantled, the timbers numbered, the old pegs drilled out and replaced with new ones. And then the barn was reassembled here about 5 miles away. And Jack, a different Jack, had put up a shelf around the top of the kitchen for his wife so she could put her 30 pies up so they could be fed to the men. And the barn was moved again, so it was built and then it was moved twice in 2007, so it's near Ivy now. And a barn raising in 1898 included the help, it's one of the bigger barns, it was 114 feet long. It needed the help of 175 men to build it, and 130 pies were baked the day before. So the men were well fed and the women worked very hard to get all the meals ready. They'd have to get at least 2 meals ready. So you're to look at the U-shaped tool hanging upside down. And you can see from the pulley further down and the rope going up that this could be moved up and down. And it's a hay fork. And hay forks were used in moving loose hay. This hay fork is still at the top of the barn that was built for O.F. Wright in 1898. And there's a 70-foot beam from a single tree. And again, the hay fork is attached to wooden tracks, which help you date the barn. And this is a wooden mallet, and it's called a beetle, and it was used to pound in pegs. And this one is at the Simcoe County Museum. I couldn't find one anywhere else. And so if you're a collector of tools, count yourself very fortunate if you have one of these, because they would take a lot of beating and they wouldn't usually survive. Now you're looking at the white part here. And this is a wooden peg. And wooden pegs were what held the barn together. So very few nails. It would be drill a hole and put a peg in. They were very strong and very flexible. So in the wind, as the barn moved a little bit, the pegs would move a little bit because they were made from the same material. And just a note, you can put a square peg through a round hole. As a boy, Alan McNabb would do just that to make pegs for the barn construction by pounding square wooden sticks into a round metal form, and he'd be around 10 or 12 at the time. You may know what it is. Do you know what it was used for? This is a pick, and it removes ice from horseshoes. This last tool, I'm looking for a volunteer to use this tool. The bigger part is hollow all the way through. And it's used to give a horse an enema. So maybe I have fewer volunteers than what I originally asked for. So that's the end of the tool quiz. Pat yourself on the back if you got some of them. Now I'm going to show you some of the barns that I took pictures of. This barn was in the Hickling family for 4 generations until it was torn down in 2018. And it's just off Bayfield Street near Midhurst. 95-year-old Harold Hickling is an amazing storyteller, and I would often meet with him at the local coffee shop. Harold's father had a number of horses to work the farm, and Harold loved horses and dogs. One winter day, Harold decided to break 2 colts, Frank and Minnie. Harnessed to a sleigh, the teenager drove the team back the lane. As they returned, the sleigh hit the rail fence. Even though the snow was deep, the horses took off at a dead gallop. Harold hadn't heeded the advice of his father, Roy, to wait for adult help. He did, however, remember his grandfather, Charlie's advice that quickly jerking the lines would keep the bit in their mouth. Harold got the horses stopped. He trained the pair the rest of the winter, and by spring, the horses responded to a verbal, "Whoa." This came in handy one day. Harold had taken the team to Barrie along with a neighbor who wanted to buy stovepipes. While Harold was buying groceries, the neighbor loaded stovepipes into the back of the wagon. The horses took off when the stovepipes fell over. Coming out of the store, Harold immediately hollered, "Whoa," and the horses stopped. 100-pound blocks of ice were lowered into space under the gangway in the winter, packed in sawdust and used to cool the milk in the summer. A neighbor and his young son stopped by to visit. The young lad was told to stay away from the hole, but of course he didn't listen and he fell in. Turnips were also stored under the gangway and accessed through a door below. The boy was retrieved uninjured through this door. And this is the inside, sort of looking through that long number of barns that were put together. So there was a double threshing floor on one side and a single threshing floor on another. The farm was sold and the barn torn down to make way for a housing project near Barrie. Eventually, the area is to house 20 to 30,000 people. Springwater Township borders on Barrie, and over the years, land has been expropriated. Fortunately, the north end of Springwater Township is very rural and many barns still remain there. As I was driving along, I immediately saw this wooden silo, and was near Berry Hill Farm. It was the only one I ever saw, and it has since been taken down. Before buying this farm, Earl Rugman was working with the neighbor's team in Dalston, where he grew up. He got off the wagon to unhitch the team, an apple in his hand. The neighbor yelled not to unhitch them, but it was too late. The team took off with Earl standing on the tongue, holding onto the apple in one hand and the horse collar with the other. When the team took off, it hit a pole, went over a rough meadow, and broke off the rack. When the tongue broke, Earl had to hold onto the tug, which is the leather strap. The horses suddenly stopped, and Earl was still holding the apple. And the barn that he farmed at had been moved from somewhere else, and it was rebuilt in 1936. But the foundation wasn't properly planned, and all the upper posts were on top of a window. So he was a bit discouraged about that. It wasn't as sound as what it might have been. 3 barns were eventually built on this farm near Highway 93, and the farm was later annexed to Barrie. George Hickling had been a merchant marine in the British Navy, and in 1819 was given 200 acres. His son Charles bought this property in 1848. The barn in the background was built in the 1850s. The second barn, the barn that they're working on right now, was built in the late 1890s. And I'm always amazed by how many people it takes to, I haven't counted them, but how many people it takes to put up a barn. And they were always willing to help. We're having a barn raising. Okay, I'll be there. Tell me what day it is. And the third barn on the same property was built in 1905. While interviewing Oscar Hickling, the 5th generation on this farm, I decided to include the water source for each farm because water sources varied from area to area. Some had all kinds of water, others did not. And I talked to some people and they said, well, we had lots of water and then the subdivision came in and suddenly I didn't have water. So I thought it would be a good record just to show at a certain time in history what the water was like on a particular farm. And in the next picture, you'll see a windmill on top of the barn, and it pumped water from a pond into a metal container in the barn. And in winter, the pond would freeze to the bottom, allowing Oscar and his 11 siblings to play hockey. A well on a neighboring relative's property was also used, but in winter, water was scarce. And 12-year-old Oscar would take a horse and sleigh to Lake Simcoe to get water. It would take him an hour to fill 4 or 5 barrels by dipping a pail into the lake. And this was done every single day. So you can see the windmill in the background. This looks a little, the house is not connected to the barn. It sort of looks like it is there, but it is separate. And if you see the road going by, it was Back Street. It was later named Willowdale. And if you're familiar with Barrie, it's now Grove Street. And the property was sold and the barns torn down in the early 1980s. So why are barns vanishing? Most were built in the late early 1900s. And barns were built for mixed farming. Every farm had teams of horses, cattle, at least one milk cow, chickens, pigs, and other livestock. And that was enough to feed their family. And over time, farmers began to feed more than just their own family. And farms continued to become more specialized. There was less variety of livestock. So instead of having a milk cow, you went to the grocery store and bought your bag of milk. And today, many farms are cash crop for wheat, corn, soybeans, canola, etc. The warmth produced by animals kept the barns warm. And when there is no livestock, freezing causes cracks to appear in the foundation. So you can see a crack coming down from the window, leading to damage as the barn shifts. So on our particular barn, we haven't had livestock for a number of years, and the crack's about 4 inches wide. And eventually the barn shifts as the foundation shifts. It was too expensive for the owners to repair this barn. Their insurance company said they had to fix it or they had to tear it down. And there are few people with the skills necessary to repair them. When this barn was being built around 1904, it wasn't finished, it was just in the process. A heavy wind flattened it. A team of horses and a boy were caught under the collapsed barn. Alex Primrose single-handedly lifted the timbers to rescue them. When a farm is sold and the house and barn severed from the land, the barn is often required to be torn down. So this barn was going to be torn down, and then there was a windstorm and it had to be torn down. And you can't see, the boys used to run across the roof, and they would also go inside and sort of swing across on the track. And when they got to where the horse was, like the other part, there was hay or straw below. But when they got to where the horse is, there was a 40-foot drop if you happened to miss. And they told me they never did. Barns are often torn down to make way for new subdivisions. These barns, built in 1874 and 1879, are destined for demolition to make way for a huge subdivision. This symbol is often found on barns. So if you go by or you have a barn of your own, often you'll see this symbol. And it's thought to be partly a religious symbol, a cross, and partly protection against fire. So the firefighters have a symbol that's similar to it, a Maltese cross. Fire is a barn's worst enemy. This barn was being demolished, and firefighters used it for training. So it was going to be burned anyway. So they just used it to give them practice if they had to fight a fire that they didn't want to be taken down. And barns sometimes burned from lightning strikes, faulty electrical wiring, overheating products. Sometimes you put hay in it and it's put in and it's wet and it heats up. Sparks from machinery, especially during the years of threshing machines. And arson can occur in abandoned barns where there are few neighbors around to keep an eye on to make sure people aren't going in. And weather damages barns over many years. Wind shear can twist timbers in seconds. And there was a wind shear that came, and the extensive damage resulted in the barn being torn down. Boards, floor planks, timbers, and the roof were salvaged and resold. And turkey vultures had raised their young in the barn by flying through the open threshing doors. So when I found out about it, I climbed up a ladder and went into a granary, and there were 2 balls of fluff, turkey vultures, and boy, did they ever hiss at me. And the barn collapsed under the weight of snow a year or 2 after that, and has since been totally gone. Working together was a necessity for a farming community, and not just for building barns. A team of horses could not pull a load of grain up a sandy hill, so farmers would wait for a second team to arrive and would then use both teams to haul each wagon up. And I was recently asked, well, why is this barn important? And just as we record other history, it's important to record the history of barns in Ontario. There were difficult times as I listened to people's stories, but there were also enjoyable memories. And the hundreds of people I interviewed often wished they'd talked to a parent or a grandparent about some of the questions I was asking. So if you have someone that you'd like to know more about their barn or whatever, talk to them. They won't always be around. And a woman whose grandfather had built barns in the area told me that I wasn't writing this book for the people I interviewed. I'm writing it for the generations to come. We learned from the stories of our ancestors. And I'll end with a poem by Emma Woods. It was found in a scrapbook. Scrapbooks are very interesting. I've got a few I need to go through of my grandmother's. A barn has so much character. It's not just steel and wood. It signifies a way of life that's good. Though some are sore neglected throughout the countryside, most do with dignity and charm exude a family's pride. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. That was a fascinating talk, and your pictures are spectacular. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, if you have any questions, please submit them through the question and answer, and we will post them to Cathy. If you want to share any stories that you might have, you are more than welcome to. When we have gotten through the question and answer period, Trish will be announcing the upcoming talks that we have, so stay tuned for that. But please, if you have any questions at all, submit them for Cathy. If I can be a little bit selfish and go first, Cathy, I have a question. I'm curious to know what is your favorite story that you've collected in all your time interviewing people and talking to people and learning their histories and their barns? What's your favorite story?
Can I tell it?
Please.
I have a dog story. Everybody loves dog stories. And this is same Harold Hickling. I mean, he had so many stories. So Harold and his brother, they were just young boys. They took their dog Jip to the vet by horse and cutter. And the vet told them there was no cure for distemper. So they brought the dog home, ready to, oh, okay. But their mother thought distemper in a dog was similar to pneumonia in a person. So she had the boys put Jip's front feet through the sleeves of a child's red sweater, and they tied it up in the back. And a mustard plaster was tucked inside the sweater and applied for 30 minutes at a time. And she also gave them an onion poultice, and it was changed every time Jip was fed warm milk from a spoon. When the vet came out to look at a cow the following spring, he was amazed to see Jip running around, the red sweater still on.
Aww.
That's my favorite story.
That's wonderful. We have a few questions coming in here now for you. So Anne wants to know, what is the oldest barn that you've seen in Southern Ontario?
The oldest one I've seen in our area is 1870. But then I talk to people who will say, oh, well, we had one that was older. And there are older ones, but they're not standing. So I have an 1870 and 1871 that are both still standing and both in fairly good condition.
Interesting.
We were later than, say, the Niagara area. And along the Penetanguishene, Highway 93, that's the barns there are older because that's the first part that people settled in this area.
Okay. We have someone who is asking, did you use the records from the Women's Institute?
I did, yes, the Tweedsmuir history. There was a time where they had all the Women's Institute write up a history of their farm. And eventually where I found them, the Tweedsmuir history, when the book was filled, would be sent to the Simcoe County Archives. So I went there to get some information.
We have Janice who is asking, they like the poem and they're wondering, is it available to the public or was it just from the scrapbook?
It was just from the scrapbook, and it was from, I don't know the woman. I couldn't find out where she came from. And the woman who put it in her scrapbook didn't really know where it had come from. She didn't know the person either. So I just used a portion of it. because it was a sad poem because their barn was being taken down. So this Emma Woods had written a poem about the taking down of the barn.
Hmm.
So I put the fuzzy part of it in. And I had another in my book. I have a different poem, and there's a woman up the road who writes poetry. So I asked if she would write a poem for the book. So it's in the book.
Oh, lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Cindy is wondering, how did you choose the barns that you featured in the book?
Every barn that's in the book, I have the owner's permission to have it because the address is there. The history of who owned it is there. So I only took pictures of barns where I had permission to go in. And so I didn't get a response from everybody who I gave an invitation to. And then when I got, I did it over time, but I didn't do it like day after day. I'd do it for a while and then I'd quit and then I'd go back. So, and then when I got 365 pages, I thought, okay, that looks like a good place to stop.
And how many barns was that, Cathy? Do you know?
I think over 160. I didn't totally count because some are like, it's usually a 2-page spread. So there's about 6 pictures. There's a story and there's a history of all the different owners. Sometimes I would get a single photograph from someone of a barn that was no longer there, but I wanted it in the book. So some it's just a single with, a few lines of the barn. So it was hard to count those. So.
Great. Okay. Cliff is wondering, do you have any photos of octagonal barns?
I don't, because there were none in the area. There used to be one down, down near Cookstown, down that way. When I was going to university, there used to be one. Eventually it was torn down. I didn't want just the fancy barns. I wanted the barns that were just in the area, and there weren't any that were octagonal. So I've seen 2. One's at Milton at the Agriculture Museum, and this other one that is long gone.
And what is the significance of an octagonal barn?
I don't really know. I don't. I'm not sure why they would do that, because they'd be harder to me, it'd be harder to put bales into, because you don't have a nice square area. So whether someone just had extra money and thought it would be really neat to have a very unusual barn. I don't know, maybe Ted can answer that.
Okay.
But
yeah, maybe Ted has an insight, or Cliff, who asked the question, because I've never heard of this before. So now I'm curious to know. Thanks, Cathy.
What was the question again?
Cliff was wondering about octagonal barns, and we were wondering what the significance was.
I don't know the answer to that either. I think they were specialized, and the one in Milton, if anyone ever has a chance to go and see the Milton Farm Museum, that is something that's really special. It's a special place.
oh, Don,
Don, do you want to ask?
I put a link in the chat space about octagonal barns.
Thank you.
And can all the attendees see that as well, Don?
It's in the, it just went to panelists. Let me redo it.
Okay, so for folks who are interested, you'll see a link coming up. So if you can check that out. Oh, Mary says, a friend once told her that it was to keep the devil out of the corners of the rectangular barns.
That would be by adding 4 more corners.
I would just
So,
like to let
I doubt
everybody
that.
know that there is a round barn in Muskoka, and I don't have I could post it. I could give it to Lindsay. I've taken a picture of it. It still exists. It's a smaller barn. but it's really an interesting building to see. So maybe it has something to do with Shakespeare.
Maybe in the globe, maybe it does.
Yeah, right.
Fascinating. Oh, Cliff says there is or was an octagonal barn on Highway 24 just east of Erin. Do you know that one, Cathy?
No, I don't know that one.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. So on a different note, Scott is wondering, do you have any information regarding fire salvaged timbers being used for barn construction in the area of Brecken?
Is this where you can see charred remains on the beams? Is that what he's asking?
Sounds like it.
Okay. In 1881, a fire went through this area, and what happened was, after it passed, the trees were sound, and so they would use those. So the barn where I grew up has charred beams. Where I live, the house burned down. So in the 1900s, maybe 1910 or 15, they moved a house and a barn from about 3 miles away and brought it to where I live now and put the two together. So if you go into the basement, so first of all, my kitchen's a barn. And if you go into the basement, there are 2 beams that are charred from fire. So they were still sound, and I mean, here we are 100 years later, they're still holding up my floor. So
we have a couple more comments coming in about the round and octagonal barns. Alan and Linda say there's a round barn in Thessalon, which is in very good condition. And someone else says that there's not an octagonal barn outside of Caledon East. And then we have History Committee member Fred Kalin, who is saying, I think the reason octagonal barns were built was because they had a turntable inside, so they could move the wagon around. So they never had to back out. So
that makes sense. Yes.
Thanks, Fred.
One of the things that I think all of us should, if you're really interested in barns, look on the website for Ontario Barn Preservation organization. They are out of Owen Sound area, and they're trying to preserve barns across Ontario. There also is a professor at Guelph University that's doing a whole study on barns as well. So it's become a matter of interest for people. As I say, it's the castles of Ontario, and they're all falling down.
Fascinating.
There is a barn in Romera that has timbers that are scarred by fires as well, and we think that barn was built around the 1860s, and I can't remember exactly where. My friend and I have taken pictures of all the barns in Romera, and I've been doing Severn Township. I'm president of Simcoe County Historical Association, and one of our goals is to have a survey done of all barns in Simcoe County, and at least have a picture taken of them initially. But then I would love to see the research put into the barn construction and so on, and the stories as Cathy has done. I'm so envious of what she has done with the stories of barns in her area. I just think that we have the same stories around Aurelia, and we just haven't found them yet. We just haven't done the research. It's a good project. I'm a little bit prejudiced about that.
So could you just repeat the, oh, sorry, Cathy. Someone's just asking Ted if you could please repeat the website info.
I don't have the but we can post that, I'm sure, through Lindsay. Yeah. They send out a story about barns every week, and actually one of their people, I mean, I know Cathy has done a talk at barn preservation up there, and but also there's a gentleman there, John, I can't even pronounce his last name.
I can spell it.
It's difficult, but he is an interesting person too, that he could talk about barns. It is our history. It is our we need to preserve our built heritage, as one of the board members at Simcoe County talks about. And we can't preserve them all. We can take pictures of them and we can reuse them in different ways. They're so expensive to repair. They're so expensive to keep up, but we can do something about making sure we have a representative collection of barns around Ontario. So ends my speech.
I was going to say, so if you have a barn, or if you know someone who has one, ask them about stories, and then perhaps send them to the Aurelia Museum. Find some place to collect them, and that might be as good a place as any. And then your one story may turn into hundreds of stories of people. We often think, oh, well, we'll ask that tomorrow, we'll do that next week, and then the person who knows isn't around anymore, and it's too late. So that's your homework. I was a teacher, so that's your homework.
Alan and Linda say they have a very good book called The Barn, a Vanishing Landmark in North America by Eric Arthur and Dudley Whitney. So Cathy, are you aware of that one?
Not that one, but there are a number of barns, or barn books, yes.
Another book that I recommend is the one about the swing barns of Niagara. And that's, I can't remember the name of the person. I know you know this person, Cathy.
Yes, he went to school with my brother. And I can't just offhand think, he and I sort of published the same year and sort of kept in contact. It's a beautiful book.
And the interesting thing about that is those barns in Niagara were built probably 50 years earlier than the barns in Simcoe County, because they were settled earlier. And so, but it's a fascinating book.
I didn't even know what a swing barn was.
Well,
Sounds like fun.
well, yeah. And the other thing that's interesting too, because it's an earlier thing, is the different technology in raising hay and produce or grain up into the mows. Cathy talked about hay forks and slings and the tracking and system and so on. That was more of an 1860 and on development. Before that, there was something called the hay rack that was with giant wheels. And we don't have any of them in Simcoe County that I know of, except for one barn that we found in Ramera that had the remnants of those things. But that's an interesting thing. The technology of barns, as Cathy pointed out, changed over time. I got interested because my uncle was a barn builder. His father was a barn builder, and they built barns around Aurelia. And I inherited pictures from my mother. I have 20 pictures of barns that were built, but I don't know where they were built. I don't know anything, but I do see a change from the 20s, because there was some technology you can tell from the 20s to the 30s. And so the barns went from post and beam to actually frame barns. And so there's lots of study that can be done about the technology of barn building that it's a good research project for some young person at university, maybe, or some history committee or history society or association. Just throwing that out there, as Cathy threw out a challenge to people too, so I'm doing that too.
And we have a thank you from Alan and Linda, Cathy, who say it's very important to capture the stories from the families who know the history. So I think that's a good note to end our discussion on today. We're going to pass it off now to Trish, who is going to wrap things up for us.
Right, so thanks, Lindsay, and thank you, Cathy, for this amazing presentation on behalf of OMAH and the History Committee. Your topic generated a lot of interest and you can see from the number of attendees we have tonight, and you generate a lot of good questions and discussion from this talk as well. And I think the initiative you had to do the research and share your knowledge through talks like these and your book, Vanishing Barns. I have bought my copy. I just have it right here. I'm looking forward to reading, going through this. It's a wonderful keepsake for generations to come of the rural landscape, as we've talked about just now. It's just so important to keep this record available. And so as you can see there, if you're interested in the book, we do have some copies available at OMAH, and we also have, there's copies available, as you can see, directly from Cathy. So thanks again, Cathy, for attending and being our speaker tonight. And I also want to thank all of you who are in attendance for your ongoing support of the speaker series in the museum. Your support is amazing. We will be sending out surveys for this talk, and we'd love to get your feedback. It's very important as we continue to develop our speaker series. And this talk will be available on YouTube if you want to let friends and family know as well. So in terms of our speaker series, normally in the summer, we take a bit of a hiatus and join up again in September, but we're going to do something different this summer. So in July, we're going to be offering a bonus presentation, and it's called Let the Fur Fly. And it's actually an art and history hybrid panel discussion, whereupon two speakers provide opposing views of Canada's historic trade in animal skins. So we have OMAH's exhibiting artist, Jill Price. She'll examine the fur trade from an imagined animal perspective, while amateur historian John Savage offers the viewpoint of his ancestor Antoine Godard, a fur trader and Aurelia's first non-Indigenous settler. So as always, as through our amazing Mary Ann Grant, who does our PR for our speaker series, there will be plenty of information coming up soon so on how to register, and will be available via Zoom again on July 14th at 7 p.m. So we hope to see you there, and thanks again, Cathy, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. All right, on that note, thank you so much, everyone, and we hope you have a safe and happy rest of your evening. Thanks so much for joining us.